And okay, great. So I'll hand this off to Jared. And again, just to reiterate for the sake of the recording, this workshop today is about how to mentor good extension hypotheses. And this part of the workshop in particular, this panel, we have 3 people joining us, and we'll have them introduce themselves. And the purpose of having them here is to bounce some ideas around and have some conversations about writing DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and access related extension hypotheses. So something I'm repeating, sorry, participants. I will mute now and turn it over to Jared.
Hey, hi everyone. Welcome back. I hope everybody had a good, productive individual meetings last week. I think we've set aside some time at the end where we can talk through some of those individual meetings as a group. I know people in my individual meetings certainly expressed a preference to do so. But first, like Jordan said, we have a group put together, Rachel, Jessica, and Flavio, here to talk about DEIA issues related to extension hypotheses. So just briefly, I think that CREP really provides a strong framework for first-time researchers, with direct replications. It really allows students to kind of see what a well-written research question looks like, and how those questions are answered by research. And then those student-written questions, I think, build on that framework. They really allow students to get experience with another part of the picture of research. For me, I like students to do as much as possible, get experience with all different aspects of the research picture. We probably all have that experience of students writing their own research questions and how those sometimes turn out. And I think CREP really provides kind of a nice scaffold where, those extension hypotheses can be built on something, and that scaffolding really allows students to come up with some interesting research questions. So for me, I know when I do replications in class, I typically discuss DEIA issues, discuss why it matters within our research. Certainly my field, which is cognitive psychology, probably could have done a better job in the past incorporating non-weird participants. Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. I think that's right. But I think more often than not, those students really, I'm preaching to the choir, right? Those students already are interested in issues like this. It's really a common thread amongst students. They really see the value of it and the importance of it, of including people that, historically weren't included. So our panel is here to talk about those issues. I'll start by having them introduce themselves. And when you introduce yourself, if you could just talk a little bit about how your research and or teaching interests overlap with either replication, DEIA issues, or both. And I'll start with Rachel and then move on to Jessica and finish with Flavio. So Rachel, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. I am Rachel Hayes-Harb. I use she pronouns, and I am at the University of Utah in the Department of Linguistics. I study the acquisition of sound systems, typically by adults, you may recognize that the acquisition of sound systems interacts with interesting questions about accent. So in our lab, we problematize this notion of accent, and we look at how accents are understood by different listeners. And when I say accents, everyone has an accent. The question is whether or not you are good at understanding the accent that you are faced with. And so much of our work flips the idea that accentedness and intelligibility of language learner speech has to do entirely with what the speaker says and the speaker does, and emphasizes the role of the listener. And so what we do is a lot of work where we're looking at the conditions under which listeners can understand speech that they may, for any of a number of reasons, believe they can't, or even demonstrate that they can't. But we can do things that convince them that they can, which, of course, reinforces this notion of intelligibility as something that happens in communication between at least two individuals. I say all that in the service of talking about how I do replication studies in my teaching. I teach our linguistics capstone class for undergraduate students. And we will very typically as a class take on a replication of a study of so-called accentedness and intelligibility together. And I find this to be just such a wonderful opportunity for students to identify really interesting extension hypotheses. And what's really exciting about students is that if you create the space for them to understand that a replication study is not, does not have to replicate the harm of the original study, what you do is you open it up to the possibility that we can do better. So I'm not sure how much detail you want me to go into. Do you want me to mention a couple of things that we do? Is that what you were looking for now?
Oh, yeah, if you'd like to, definitely.
Okay, so one of the things we do, hugely problematic in cognitive psychology, as has been mentioned, is the way we characterize humans and the way we characterize their backgrounds and their experiences. So one thing we take on in this critical replication study approach is the question of how individuals are categorized. And this can go from whether they are considered male or female, or even worse, right? When people will report like 45 participants, 19 male, with the obvious implication that the other half are going to be female, so it doesn't need, or the rest of them will be female, so it doesn't even need to be specified. What we do is we ask questions about how we could collect information from participants that will get us the information that's actually far more accurate about their gender or their sex. And we figure out what it is we actually want to know and what the authors might have meant. And then, so we ask questions, we add questions like, how do you want to be categorized, right? So we find that to be a way that is maximally inclusive of people with different backgrounds. We also problematize this notion of native speaker. So we very flippantly will say, you know, we involve some native speakers as though that means something. And in fact, it doesn't. It doesn't mean anything at all. And in fact, it's an incredibly harmful term because it, well, I can go into why. I have a whole speech on why the term native speaker is no good. So we come up with these fuller linguistic background questionnaires that will actually capture the human experience with respect to language of participants, right? But then the other thing I wanted to mention is when we're thinking about extension hypotheses, the students are fantastic at identifying ways in which the original authors did not take into account some interesting hypothesis with respect to justice and liberation. And they will then take those ideas and we try and figure out how to incorporate them into an extension hypothesis. So for example, if in a most recent study we used metrics of explicit bias to try and figure out if we could explain some of the variance in responses, right? And so we had this question about like, well, what happens when we actually ask participants about their biases towards people with various accents or from different backgrounds to see if we can explain any additional variance by doing so. And that's just a brilliant way that the students can think of, right, to problematize the original study, but do the replication and then extend it in this way that is focused on their values. Did I do what you wanted, Jared?
That was excellent. Thank you, Rachel.
All right.
Okay, Jessica, I'll turn it over to you just a little bit about your research and or teaching interests and how they relate to replication, DEIA, or both.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jess Remedius. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me here today. I'm at Tufts University in Medford, Mass. I'll tell you a little bit about my research first and then some of the classes that I teach, I guess. So my research is in social psychology and intergroup relations. And in my lab, we focus on oh, and I use she, her pronouns. I knew I was forgetting something. That's why I paused. So in my lab, we study mechanisms and experiences of discrimination and prejudice. And we do this from the perspective of marginalized individuals. And so our questions are typically starting with issues and concerns that are relevant to people who are marginalized. And this is a theme that cuts across lots of different topics and questions that we're studying. And so I think from this perspective, we're saying that we are not positioning the majority group as a default perspective, or even building our research questions from research that involves a dominant or majority group. We're starting with an experience that is marginalized and prioritizing that experience. So some of the research that we've done has looked at experiences of identity threat. So for example, how do people of color detect discrimination in the environment? What are factors that heighten identity threat in an environment? What are the effects of this? And also, what are some of the consequences and backlash that a person may experience for speaking out against discrimination? We also, whenever we can, try to adopt an intersectional perspective. And this means recognizing not only the social location of our participants, but also our own social locations. And we are often in our lab and our meetings and our discussions when we're thinking about research questions, talking through issues of what are the various privileges and types of power that we have. How does that affect the way that we're approaching our research questions? And this is really the same way that I approach my teaching too. So I think the most relevant class to this panel that I teach is a class on social identity and stigma, and it's an advanced undergraduate level class. And that class has really evolved over time to be about deconstructing research in this area of social psychology, to think about what are some ways of doing future work, replication work, transformative work that's not going to, as Rachel already mentioned, perpetuate or replicate harm that's been done. So we spend a lot of time reading research on identity threat and stigma, a lot of experimental social psychology work, but increasingly we're spending more time just diving into ongoing work in the field about the position of researchers, thinking about positionality, ongoing work on the philosophy of science, research with respect to the weird acronym that was already mentioned and what are concerns about that, or what's the benefit of, again, recognizing the skewedness in our samples. And we have, in the past, students have not collected data on our replication hypothesis, but have proposed replications and extensions of research, of other primary research that we've read. And they're thinking deeply at this point about not just what is one additional condition that they can run, I think, but really about how the theory underlying the research and how the approach to the research really needs to be infused with DEIA. And so the class of changes every time I teach it, because the students are are coming in with kind of different backgrounds and experiences and bringing that to the class. And I just try to kind of go with that and see where it takes us. And so it's been a really fun class to teach over the years. But I think I'll stop there if that's everything, or let me know if I've missed anything.
No, that's great. Thanks, Jessica. Flavio, okay, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Hi there, everybody. First and foremost, I'm in awe of the two speakers that came before me. Mine will be a much shorter presentation, and I'm here a lot to learn together with you. So my name is Flavio Azevedo. I'm a newly minted assistant professor at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. I did my postdoc in Cambridge and my PhD in Germany in political science, and I consider myself to be a political psychologist, but I'm at the social psych department now. Essentially, my research is about social justice, and I like to say that the main question of my research interests is why some people believe that nation or people or race or gender or species justify dominating and controlling and exploiting one another. So it's very social justice-y, although the boundaries of what is social justice nowadays, because of the polarization and because of how everything became political, is different. Now it's no longer about different arguments for the benefit of the people, improving people's lives, their welfare, but vaccinations became political, talking about sexism, misogyny, all of that things, you know. So that's my research part, but I think that Jordan invited me here because of my work in FORT. So the Framework for Open and Reproducible Research Training. FORT is an international and interdisciplinary organization in the field of open science. And what we're trying to do step by step and very slowly is to provide a sort of a good community, a safe community for people to talk about how to improve our science in a kinder way. So moving away from methodological reform and pointing fingers, and more about building community, being aware of the several systematic issues and power structures that exist out there, and explain why some people do what they do with respect to their science, but also at the meta level side of things. And at FORT, we do quite a few things that are sort of related to the topic at hand, but they are justice related in the sense of, first, we try to make everything accessible, just because a lot of the works in open science are profoundly closed, unfortunately. So we do summaries, we do a glossary, we did a glossary of terms. We also meet with stakeholders together with Ayanna Thomas and Yuchi Shoda from Washington University and Melanie Klein from ZIPS. So we try to meet with stakeholders to try to address the issue that open science practices might influence some groups over the others. And we keep having learning about it, and soon enough, hopefully there will be a contribution out of this. We also try to think about authorship in a way, authorship order in a way that privileges those that are most disprivileged. So we developed this academic wheel of privilege to help us define, essentially, without the figure is hard to see, but essentially we sort of enumerate several identities, and folks discuss their authorship based on their contributions that they did on the paper, as well as the privileges that allow them to that they hold, that allow them to contribute in a certain way, right? So it's one of the ways that we had at our community to find ways towards privileging the less privileged, giving them positions of attention: first author, last author, corresponding author, and etc. We also do other things. So we have an initiative on neurodiversity, for example. So we highlight that neurodiversity is a brain variation that affects the way that we learn, the way that we communicate and socialize with folks, and that has been sort of a missed demographic of D&I initiatives, and so we're trying to shed light to empower those scholars that are neurodiverse and struggle a lot with the academic system. And with that, I'll stop, and thanks, Jared. Look forward to this.
Thank you, Flavio. Thanks to all of our panel members for being here. So if everybody, in lieu of everybody introducing themselves, if you could just write in the chat who you are and why you are here, like what made you decide to sign up for this workshop, what's motivating you to be here. As you're doing that, as you're writing that out, I'm just going to kind of give you a rundown of how we're going to do this. So we've prepared questions for the panel, but really we want to ensure that all of your questions get answered. So if you have a question at any time, feel free to use the raise hand function. That'll put you in a queue. If you want, you can just write that out and either send that to me directly or put that in the chat, and I'm happy to read that question for you as well. So I'll give everybody a little bit of time to write out who you are, where you're from, what university you're at, and what made you decide to join this panel.
I want to attend a panel where these folks are the ones talking.
Well, stick around for the later part of the day, because that's basically what we do.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a good bunch.
Okay, I think most people have had a chance to write out their introductions. I'll let those trickle in, and I'll start here with the first question. So from my experience, I think students, they want to include DEIA issues, but they don't really have a solid reason to do so. We read through past research and students will criticize and say, oh, the gender breakdown is off. There's not enough racial diversity, but they can't really articulate why that's important, or even like what differences they would expect as a function of gender, race, ethnicity, or anything else. So the question, and I think put this to Rachel first and then Jessica and Flavio, what are some ways that we can do good DEIA related extension hypotheses that are based in theory? Rachel?
Yeah, I I think I might reject the assumption that we have to have a good theoretical reason to do this. I think that I guess we could articulate a theory of inclusiveness, right? But the idea that there has to be some specific justification for making our research programs do more good, I think is a good thing already in and of itself. I think there's so much, for students to, I don't think you necessarily have to have a hypothesis about racial differences. In fact, I think depending on the research type, that might actually be both unnecessary and harmful. But considering things like, what is the experience of the humans who are participating in my research? What questions are we going to ask them? What things do we think are going to potentially be useful? We spend a lot of time in my class talking about these demographic things. Like why is gender privileged as a categorization in our research? Why is age something we tend to report in our research? And a lot of times we can't come up with really good reasons. And we say things like, well, it's just the way we always do it, or the previous study reported this, and that's just the convention. I actually think these are such fantastic opportunities to raise these sensibilities in the next generation of researchers. And like, we have conversations like, are we going to ask people this? What are we going to do with that information? And I find that my students say the most brilliant things, right? We're always talking about like, one, what do we need to know, or what do we think we need to know? It's always what we think we need to know in order to do a good study. And what is the experience of the participant in providing this information to us? What are we telling them, right? Because participants are having, like, their lives are actually happening while they are participating in our studies. And depending on what questions we ask them, we can be implying value. And we have this really interesting type of power in the research setting when participants are involved in our studies. Like, there's this implication of some kind of expertise, right? And we must have a reason for it. And so I think just asking questions about whether or not we need to ask various questions. I got off on a tangent, but that's one I feel really strongly about.
No, that's great. Thank you. Jessica, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, not too much. I just want to echo, I guess, what Rachel said, because I think that was also, I had a similar reaction that we don't often feel the need to articulate a theoretical reason to do research with convenience samples or with predominantly majority group samples. And so I guess that sets up this like asymmetry, right? And so I think the idea that inclusion should be an overall goal of our research is I think a really helpful and productive way to go into this. I think one thing that I really like about working through these questions with my students is that often students are like approaching this because they don't see themselves, or the way they approach is informed by the fact that they don't see themselves represented in the research, right? So they may be coming at the research with a question that's informed by personal experience or informed by some knowledge or understanding that they have because of things that they've gone through that's not reflected in who the participants are. And I think that's really important. And I think it's something that we historically haven't reinforced or like rewarded in psychology, right? So there's this idea that like scientists, we all know this, right? Like this idea that scientists are supposed to be objective and we're not supposed to be in the research. But I think students, especially marginalized students, are often really looking for that because that's easy for someone to say when they see themselves all the time in the work, right? But when you don't see yourself and you know that this research just doesn't resonate with you or your family experiences or your personal experiences with identity, it can be really personally important. So I think, now I'm going off on a tangent, but I think the reason that led me to this is because that's often, I think, not always, but often the theoretical motivation, I think, for underrepresented students. It's more a personal motivation, but I think it's an important one. So for me, that's often enough. And I actually encourage them to talk about that, to kind of blur this line between like the personal and the professional, right? And to say that like, we're not gonna have the kind of guys in this class that our own values and experiences and biases are not informing what we're doing. We're gonna openly talk about that and then talk through how it may or may not connect to the existing literature that we've that we know about. And I think that can kind of like bring us back to the literature. So that's I guess my entry point often into like why we're asking these kinds of questions.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I feel like lived experiences can be really important. I've moved towards having students write positionality statements, and at first I was hesitant to do so, but I'm really glad that I did. Flavia, is there anything you'd like to add on to the discussion?
Can you remind me of the original question? My brain, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I didn't
Alrighty.
mean to go off screen. We're having a storm here and my ladder just fell over. Is there a reason that we want these extension hypotheses to be based in theory, right? Is there like a theoretical reason why, we want to look at how people might differ as a function of gender, race, or age, or anything like that?
No, so now I totally get what Rachel and Jessica said first. Yes. So what they said. The second thing is that we need to grapple with the fact that our theories, for good or worse, have been provided by a specific demographic with a lot of privilege and in a given time. And today, as we grapple with rising inequities and essentially the planet saying, I can't take it anymore, perhaps there can be other ways that people will analyze new extend hypothesis to look at something more critical, right? And also, especially hypotheses that question the status quo, whatever the status quo is. Sometimes it's the theory, sometimes it's the frame under which that theory is encompassed. But I think giving the most important thing is to give students a sense of agency. I feel that we have two ways of teaching. We either defend a theory that, we're experts on this and we have a tendency to focus on how good that is and the good that it does, or we're extremely critical. And either way, we're removing students with a sense of agency. And I think that sense of agency, meaning that they can contribute, it is super important, that we should be focusing more on giving the notion to students that they are lived experiences, but also different theories from other disciplines may also help them into analyzing these sort of things. Of course, this is undergrads, and often enough they sort of lack a little bit of the over-encompassing structure knowledge for that. That's normal, but everybody can use their own lived experiences for more hypotheses.
Okay, thanks, Flavia. So Jacob's put a question in here, and then I'll go to Ellen. And Jacob, this is actually our second question here. So I know that some of us come from schools that are not very demographically diverse. I've done projects before where, we were curious about differences in ethnicity, and we got one or two people of that ethnicity. And so both Jacob's question and our question, do you have any suggestions for recruiting participants from minoritized groups? Dana has put in there snowball sampling. Are there any other ways? Like a lot of people are responding. Jessica, I see your hand up. I'll go to you first.
Thanks. I have some thoughts that are not necessarily solutions, so I'll just put this out there that this may be a bit of an unsatisfying answer, but something that I always think about when questions like this come up, which I think are really important, really practical questions, are that we have systemic incentives in psychology that make the recruitment of diverse and representative samples difficult. And those incentives are some of the same incentives that make doing open science difficult, I think, which is that we're supposed to publish a lot, we're supposed to publish quickly, we're supposed to publish on particular timelines, like tenure track timelines, right? And so I think my approach to this is that, well, when you're interested in a particular group, you need to recruit sufficient members of those groups to do the statistical analyses you want. Descriptive research is also really important and really valuable and perhaps requires fewer participants, but I think that it takes time and resources to do that kind of work that is not necessarily the case for convenient samples, and I'm using that term really broadly, but samples that are just, easier to access. And I think that our field doesn't value that enough. So we should, I think, when we're, people who are in positions of power on editorial boards and tenure committees and other various positions of power, we're looking at and evaluating someone's work, should look at that work and say, okay, well, this person took 2 years to do a study with a really important and understudied and undervalued perspective, and we should reward that in proportion to the amount of effort that it took, I guess. And we don't currently have that. And so I guess I want to highlight that, because I think that we often are looking for solutions that will line up with the current incentives. And I want to put out there that I think the incentives themselves need to change. And I know that that's not something that an individual person can accomplish. So of course, we also need strategies for how to do the work and different recruitment techniques and so on and so forth. But I really think we need to be questioning just why it is that we need to do data collection quickly, and sort of like, why is it that our field, when it recognizes that we have a lack of diversity within our samples, also still is pushing everyone to do this work on these various timelines?
Yeah, thank you. Rachel, go ahead.
I wanted to just reinforce, applaud and reinforce what Jessica just said. There's also, it's not just hard work. It's work that has to be done with care. And because of that, like, it's not just time, it's a skill set, it's a set of sensibilities, and it has to be done with so much care, because otherwise we risk just tokenizing individuals for the sake of claiming that we have diversity.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Flavio, is there anything you'd like to add on to that?
Yeah, and these norms are so needless. We're always learning. Every 5 years, we're learning, actually, we need something else. So in neurodiversity research, it was impossible to get any paper in if you didn't have confirmatory diagnosis. So you had the sample, and then you had to make sure that those people had the actual disease that they claimed that they did. And of course, that research on this has shown that this is useless and a lot of time. And before it was just large samples, and now it's representative samples. Now it's representative samples in non-weird countries. And when you think about big team science and all of this, it's always more. It's such a new liberal, I think these norms, in a way, they perpetuate the privilege that some institutions have. So it's just like, what is the next thing that Ivy League schools can do that nobody else can do? And we're, it's methods, it's intensive statistics, it is these kind of samples and funds and etc. So in many ways, we need to question this and all these norms and find ways to accumulate knowledge in a more community-based way.
Yeah, thank you all. Ellen, did you have a question still that you'd like to ask?
Yes, I had a follow-up question for the first topic we asked. So I'm going to give try to keep my context very small, but I think it's important. I replicated the Sparkman in Walton, which basically was just saying if students receive a static versus dynamic framing about consuming less meat, that will influence how they respond to the question. And one of my group's extension hypotheses was this is how I interpret it. They're like, students at VCU won't fall for that because of characteristics of our student body. And like, we understand like why you shouldn't eat more meat. And I'm wondering if I perhaps did not value their experiences enough, because my response, I believe, was something like, well, this is thought to be a psychological phenomenon. And basically you're saying, well, we are special, it doesn't apply to us. And so in hindsight, I'm thinking, how might I have probed what they were bringing to the situation differently so that I can be better next time?
I have a couple of maybe questions back for you. This sounds really interesting. I don't know anything about this type of research. I can't help, and maybe I just don't have enough context here, but I can't help but think that there was a certain amount of elitism in the way they were thinking about this question. Am I capturing that right? Like they're too smart to be tricked by this, and they already know the stuff, so it's not new information for them?
Possibly, maybe elitism, because we're already, we go to this school because we're hip and we get it.
Oh, I see.
About vegetarianism.
I see. Okay, so I actually think this brings up really interesting questions about positionality, and it seems like maybe encouraging them to probe their own positionality through through an exercise of reflexivity, like one that's actually real, right? Because you can do positionality as just like a list of demographics, and but if we think about reflexivity as very much embedded within the research process and responsive to the research questions and the history of the research, I wonder if it sounds like they were being introspective. This doesn't like solve the problem of how to go about the extension question. But it sounds to me like it's an opportunity for you to have them explore their own positionality.
Thank you. I like that suggestion.
So we have a question from Jordan about the use of disclaimers. And Jordan, I'm going to let you, I'm going to let you ask that question.
Okay, I forgot what the question was. Hang on a second. Let me get into my email, which is
sorry.
where no, that's okay. I should have had it available. So I'm searching for the word Jared in my email. And God, I know too many Jareds. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. Oh yeah. This was a good question, me. So, and I think that this comes from a place of like I don't want to generalize. I don't know if this is true or if this is just what I think, but I think a lot of the people who teach using CREP are also interested in like other open science things and are sort of like early adopters and like into like social justice and stuff like that, and have this sense of like introducing a lot of weird type issues. And so I think there are students kind of latch onto that as well. Like, okay, yeah, like you've spent a lot of time talking about how this is, this works this way in this population, but we don't know anything about people outside of this population. And so my students in particular will like kind of jump on for their extension hypotheses, be like, okay, like let's look at SES and gender. And I guess if the question I had about disclaimers was like, I don't know if that's even the right word, but if you are talking to a group of students and you want students to just not kind of go after this stuff like kind of thoughtlessly, right? Like what disclaimer would you give them? What little nugget of wisdom would you give them so they aren't like doing that, like replicating harm or like making assumptions about a population? Like Yeah, I guess briefly, even though I was not brief. Jessica?
I think it's a great question, and I'm wondering if I can steal Rachel's answer from the previous question, because I also think this is a really great place to talk about positionality, because this is the natural conversation, I think, that will come out of a discussion of positionality, right? So if we're spending time in class kind of reflecting on our identities and even the identities that are salient to us versus not salient to us, and how that lines up, usually perfectly with the identities that we don't have privilege for versus the ones that we do, which are less salient. Then you start to have a conversation about, okay, well, how does this reveal maybe some of the blind spots or some of what I don't know about the experiences that I'm interested in? And then you have to start talking about, like, how do you try and like minimize power discrepancies between yourself and your participants? And I don't know if minimize is the right word, but you have to deal, you have to negotiate that, right? And so that is going to, I think, it's going to start a conversation about what you're talking about, which is how, especially if the researcher is an outsider, not an insider within the group, they're coming from outside the group. I think this is where scientists have to be very careful about how we approach our research questions. And so I think that, in combination with discussions about how we are not we don't want to be extractive when it comes to collecting data. We are not just taking data away from our participants and then going off and doing something important with it. Our participants are providing us with their time and with their understanding and with their experience, and we have to be good stewards of that, I think. So that sort of like ethics kind of conversation overlapping with positionality might be one way to address it. And I'm sure there are others, but that's sort of what came to mind for me.
That's so helpful. Thank you.
And sorry, I think you asked for sort of like a quick disclaimer, but I know that wasn't that, but
No, deep down, that's really not what I wanted. And now I know that. No, yeah, this is really great. And I think this is hugely helpful. And I much prefer this over a disclaimer, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, go ahead, Rachel.
In my teaching, I like to think of myself as like a pragmatic agitator. And what I find really useful is, when you have students, especially students coming from multiple types of backgrounds and life experiences, the ones who perhaps have the most new information to contribute are the ones who feel whose types of knowledge, whose ways of knowing, and whose life experiences have already been devalued in the university setting. So I find it pretty interesting to have basically burn it all down conversations, right? Like, what if we were to recreate all of this from scratch, right? How would we create a just way of a just scholarship? And then we end up needing to bring it all together, right? Because I am, after all, an agent of this colonial system in enough ways, right? Because I need to survive within the system in order to change the system. I could talk all day long about how often I cry in my pillow over this push and pull. But I think that inviting students to engage in the burn it all down discussion, right? Legitimizing those thoughts and feelings and the ways in which they, as the future of the field, right? I mean, these are our most junior colleagues. Encouraging them to do that really puts them in a position where these new perspectives have value in the context. There's like some cachet associated with being willing to burn it down, right? And I think from there, we can build something back up that is more thoughtful. So, I mean, I find these conversations to be really indulgent, and if you set them up, I mean, sometimes they don't go as well as other times, but if you set them up to be like, let's just backstroke through the how problematic we find all of this. They're pretty good at it. Sorry, that was longer than I meant.
Could I add one more thought? Sorry, Flavia, if you want to jump in, feel free to interrupt me, because I've already been talking, but I just wanted to say that I also fully endorse the burn it down conversations. And I've resisted that for a long time, because I think I felt some like responsibility to be like this guardian of psychology for my students, like someone like the defender of the discipline, so that they wouldn't all, run away. And of course, I want to engage students in the conversation and in the discipline, I mean, but I think that they really were craving that like they pushed me, in fact, right? They pushed me as someone who, as Rachel put it, is working within the discipline, who's socialized within the discipline, right? And who didn't know what I didn't know. They were pushing me to say like, well, but aren't, the theories that you're telling us we're supposed to connect our research to, for example, highly racist and sexist in so many ways, and what do I do with that? And that's just one example, and I didn't really have a response for them, so I think that kind of stepping back and saying like, I'm not wedded to any of this. How, what should we do differently? It can be really refreshing for you too, I think, as the instructor. So I endorse that.
I think folks said a lot, and very well said. So
Perfect. I want to say,
I appreciate that. Thank you. Sorry.
if you're not monitoring the chat, there's a lot of good supplementary information in there. One of the questions we had about our data is that we post it publicly. Do you have advice then for, we get a participant who they have unique and identifying information, what would we do with somebody like that to ensure their safety?
This is a really great question, and I don't know that I have a very good answer to it, but I think the context this often comes up in my lab is with respect to the types of demographic questions that we're asking, and how if a person who is underrepresented answers a certain number of those questions, like if they are the only person or one of a few people in the sample or in a class or whatever it may be who has that confluence of identities, like they are identifiable, right? I think this comes up too in like institutional surveys. If you're asking people for like their rank, and they are like, a person of color who's a full professor, who is gender diverse, they may be the only person, right? Which is the state of the inequality in our institution. So I think that for me, what I struggle with is the importance, I think, of recognizing people's identities and intersectionality with not identifying them. And it may be, I think where I've landed in some ways is that there are some times where I can't post that information publicly. But I still have a value of making my data accessible. So that's not an answer. It's just that it's something that I struggle with.
Jessica, I struggle with this too. And I find that in the spirit of transparency, taking it out and saying you're taking it out and why, right? Just having some kind of documentation, like this information, at the discretion of the researcher, this information was not shared. And like, then we're like transparently opaque, right?
I think one final question too that I'd like to get to before this ends at 11, and we may go past that time. I know some of our panel members may need to leave at 11, but we may push this to 11:15 if the conversation's still going. But for all of our panel members, are there resources, for students or at least instructors that we should be knowledgeable about before we get started with this?
I think there's some great readings on positionality and applying intersectionality in psychology, which does not have to be a methodological tool, but can be a social justice tool, right, for incorporating DEIA. So I'd be happy to share some of the things that I come across, if that's helpful.
Yeah, that would be great. I know Dana has put something here in the chat. If anybody else has anything that they can drop into chat, that would be really helpful.
I can maybe send some things along to you, Jared and Jordan, Mark. I'm one of those folks that needs to leave at 12, or 12 my time. But I just wanted to say before I jumped off that I really enjoyed being here. So thanks for having me, and enjoy the rest of the workshop.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Enjoyed having you.
So
that does bring us, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, you go ahead.
So that does bring us to 11. If anybody has, I guess the end of the hour, because we're all on different time zones. Does anybody have any additional questions they'd like to ask the panel about anything DEIA related? Okay, we do have more questions, but I think in the interest of time, we could maybe end it there. Just, out of respect for our panel who has joined us here today. Okay, Jordan, I'm going to turn it over to you if you'd like.
Sure.
Thank you all to the panel. Really appreciated you all being here. Really good ideas. Yeah, thank you.
Do you have any concluding thoughts you would like to leave us with, Flavio and Rachel?
Just to say that I can be here a little bit more if there is questions or if there's a conversation.
Clearly, this group is, there's some incredible wisdom and experience here.
We have we have a lot of folks who have also used CREP a lot in their classes, and then folks who have never used it before, and people who have been reviewers and executive reviewers, and a wide variety of different areas of expertise, but all people who sort of, and I think I said this in my introduction of I'm here because it's at the center of that Venn diagram on purpose and pedagogy and integrity. And I think that that's probably the case for a lot of our participants too. I think I struggle with this a lot because I think, and I may just, this is sort of conversational, so apologies for that. But one of the things I struggle with is a lot of the studies that we pick or have been picked, the original papers, have some problems. A couple of them have, so for example, there's one that measures SES. It's just what is your income? And it that is the whole SES question. It's in categories, and it's and then they're kind of using that to sort of, make claims about SES. I think they also asked gender and race as well in that paper. It's been a while since I've read it, but we have this really direct replication thing that we do where we don't like to mess with those original stimuli. And so there's this correction that we have to do. And I like this critical replication studies approach where it's well, how should we address this and how we talk about this paper or extension hypotheses that we have. I don't know. I'm just interested if you have thoughts on that, which is a very vague cloud of thoughts that I just threw at you. So if not, that makes sense. So what do you do when you're working with a student? I probably can anticipate what you're going to say, but when you're working with a student on a replication study, how do you weigh the balance of like being critical toward the original study, especially when not even especially, but that when that author has been like really helpful? I don't know.
If you've been around enough, you've done the harms too, right?
And for sure.
So it's actually quite easy for me to say, to give an author a heads up, and to say it's out of respect for your work that we're actually going to pursue this. And like me, I'm assuming you have learned some things over the years about the harm you do with your research, right? Or via your research. And it reinforces this idea that like science is a social activity, right? And this is how we talk about science in any course I teach, right? Science is a social activity. It works in a particular set of ways, and those ways tend to be pretty harmful. And so we're going to take them on, and we're going to take them on bravely and boldly, right? But also with kindness. And I think that like this notion of like kindness and care, like they're thought to be like they don't belong in science. And I think they absolutely do, right? Like, and those are the sorts of things we're starting to recognize when we say like who I am affects how I do science, right? And there's actually value to me introspecting and thinking about how I do things. But I think just humility on our own parts can be really useful. And I like to give authors a heads up, right? It's not about trashing them. It's about moving the field forward. And, they can choose to see that as an attack or as support for their work and respect for their work. But I don't know, beyond that, I don't actually feel particularly responsible for their feelings. I think that's what you were asking about, like if the author's been really helpful in your challenging things.
Yeah, I sort of have wrestled with this a lot this past semester because there's one study in particular that I think the way the stimuli were selected for use is just really problematic, and I don't know why they were selected, so that could be an assumption that I'm making. I'm kind of trying to figure out like how and if I want to communicate with the authors on that. Mm-hmm. And eventually when it's written up for publication, like what this will say. And it's just like kind of something I'm working through now and have actively involved some students in too, where, it's like, how do we weigh that in a diplomatic and kind and careful way. But yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
What I would say is that we, as many of the arguments that have been put forward in this workshop, is that we are embedded in a structure, in a series of systems and layers, and that a lot of the replications have been used to attack often enough minorities. And while replications is a good thing and we need to move our science forward, as with everything, as with every advanced, it's used inequitably, and it has been weaponized to attack minorities and early career scholars and social media, but also elsewhere. So there's many, unfortunately, many cases of this, and we have a name for it, but it's called broken science. But unfortunately, this system pervades. So I think it's important whenever you're replicating somebody else's work to be very kind in your message, to position yourself outside of that system or acknowledge that system to clarify that, oh, thank you, Jordan, I was just doing that. to clarify that, what are the intentions. And even nowadays, there are very well-funded institutes for replications that are puzzlingly choosing, for example, very social justice-y papers to replicate. And it's, if you look at their website, or if there's clearly a trend there. And in part because a lot of the right-wing media is funding this replication initiatives, and they have some sway into what gets replicated or not. That's not at all at CREPE's, but CREP is embedded in a system of replications where every time your paper gets replicated, that's threatening to you. And that's one of the things that we were discussing in Ford, is how those replications have been weaponized to put fear on marginalized scholars. And that's just a fact. And there's very little one can do about it, except positioning yourself as a difference.
Yeah, that makes sense. I appreciate that. Are there any follow-up questions? If not, we can, I'm sure, throw your contact information toward our participants. And I don't know why I said throw, that was a weird verb. Give it to them. And have them follow up with you. These are, I happen to know, both Flavio and Rachel pretty well, and they're lovely humans. They put up with me, so low bar.
I love you, so we don't put up with you. You're a gift in our lives.
That's why I invite him. No, that's actually, his Zoom box is like right here on my screen, so that's what I'm doing that. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us. And I don't know, I'm really bad at endings, so just clap emojis. Thank you. Your expertise is really helpful and important. And if you think of anything else to pass along, please do.
Thank you for organizing this.
Yay.
Fantastic. Thanks for the invitation. It was good to get to know y'all a little bit.
Thank you.
Bye.
I was just reading an article a month or so ago on where they looked at how acceptable people consider bias against different gender and racial groups. And so they did male, female, white, black, and older, younger. And it turned out that the one group that people felt that it was acceptable to engage in bias against is older white males. And I could just imagine what Fox News would do with that research.
Yeah, that's uncomfortable. Yeah, I've seen that weaponization happen, and it is definitely uncomfortable. Okay, let's I think we have a break scheduled from quarter after, so a few minutes from now, until 5:30. So let's go ahead and start it a little early, I guess. When we come back, we'll have a longer discussion about extension hypotheses. So that gives us about 18 minutes. And you have something you want to share, Flavio?
No, do I stay or?
No, you can go ahead. Yeah, you can go ahead and go. Sorry. I mean, you can hang out. It's like, but
all
no.
right. Okay. Then I tried to copy your email. I couldn't. Send me an email if you can. And also, nice to see you, Mark, here. As people I know, I just want to say hi and love this, and would be happy to participate in another as long as it's helpful. Have a great day, everybody. And thank you, Jordan, for being so awesome.
Oh, well, yes. Okay, so going to go ahead and take a break, come back. we'll talk about extension hypotheses, but then we can all like it can be pretty flexible. Today's a pretty flexible day. So if you have anything else you like really want to make sure we talk about came up in individual meetings, we can bring it up then. Okay, go have a break, have some fun. I'll be here. Okay, bye. And we can, you know, keep today, like I said, it's pretty flexible. I mean, this is our first time doing this workshop. And so there are kind of some things that evolve like as we go along. I do know, you know, I reached out to CREP alum to come and talk to us this afternoon. And I know 1 or 2 people will be there. They have both been my students. And so I think they've probably had a very different experience than other CREP alums have. Plus, you know, they'll be talking in front of me. And while I see them both as being fairly honest people, like there is that they don't want to let me down type thing. Even if I left while they talked, I don't think that they would probably necessarily say anything critical. And I just want to acknowledge that they can talk a little bit about their experiences and the things that were difficult, and also understand that like they are the students who are probably most deeply engaged. I mean, I had a lot of students in this class that they were both in this last time who, you know, didn't really contribute much to the CREP project, and who wrote the empirical report at the end and used the data and wrote it up. But and that's okay. That's how I run things, and I think that that's fine. And they still wrote the paper and they still understood the study in depth. And so, you know, that's the most I can ask for. So, but between now and then, so we have from 11:30 to I think 12:30, we will talk, you know, a little bit about extension hypotheses. We've already talked about that already somewhat, but I think having a conversation, it's one of the things folks are really interested in. But I think we can also jump in with like big questions you had from your individual meetings. Did the scheduling for the individual meetings work out okay? So do you think would folks be okay if we did it this way again next week? Okay, if you want a time that's outside of that, just email me and let me know, and one of us will figure out a time to make that happen. But I'll open up a sign up sheet pretty early. And if you want them to be a little bit longer, like if you found yourself needing more time, absolutely like sign up for more than one slot, and we can probably open up, you know, more slots if needed. Or Jared and Mark and I will talk about that offline and get back to you on how that will work. But we did have some empty slots. So the other thing I think to keep in mind is our last workshop will be in 2 weeks, our last like group workshop. We will have some free time then to do the more like interactive stuff, which I've been talking about. One of the things that we have planned for that workshop is for participants to spend some time talking about the whatever activities or projects they've been working on. So if you're writing a syllabus for a class, or if you're writing like a rubric for an assignment, or if you want to just sketch out like, when I teach this class, this is how I'm going to do it, and these are my ideas. I think folks seem to get a lot out of hearing how other people plan on doing things, because they can kind of like steal ideas and make them theirs. And then if 2 folks kind of want to do things the same way, maybe you can stay in touch and share materials down the road. So we're going to start that next meeting with that. So not next week, which is individual meetings, but the meetings after that, where people share, you know, what they've been working on in whatever form that takes. And some of these are going to be more developed. Like, keep in mind that some of you are just learning about CREP for the first time, and some folks have first authored CREP articles, and some folks have done CREP multiple times in their classes, and some people have been reviewing for years. So there's no bar that's being set of any kind. It's like whatever you're working on. If you spend 10 seconds talking, fine. If you spend 397 seconds talking, that's probably also fine. it's a relatively small group and we have plenty of time set aside for that. And I think from that, we're going to go into like the hackathon type things where we'll like set up sort of different rooms for people to work on different types of things. I'll again talk to Mark and Jared about this a little bit more, but what I had in mind was like looking at that wish list of things that we have on the NSF schedule that we started, I think, a couple weeks ago, and maybe binning those into different types of categories and having people like, oh, you know, we really want this type of resource, so let's just get together and start working on it and put it on the OSF page, which I believe I have all of you added to. So, okay, questions about any of that? I know I still owe you an email with W-9 type things, and that is still coming. And I felt like there was something else I needed to mention, but it'll come at some point. So we'll work on this for a little bit and then take our break, and then we'll talk to some CREP alum starting at 1 o'clock, okay? So, extension hypotheses, who has done them? Amanda's raising her hand in spirit. Because, oh yes, last Monday was CREPCon, and I know a few people were able to make it. Yay, thank you. And Amanda had 3 students who presented, and they all had extension hypotheses from the Troy et al. I raised your hand for you. So yeah, so I think we may have you, you know, those of you who have done extension hypotheses kind of pitch in and let us know like what's worked, what hasn't worked. A lot of mine have been with thesis students who are like a little bit more invested and are going to present their research and yada yada. So let's kind of just get started in on what they look like and what some other people have done. And I've shown you a little bit of this already. I'm going to share my screen. I'm hoping, okay, all of my, okay. So, okay. Here's one example that I really think is cool to start with. This was a kind of a weird project. So, and not a lot of folks may know about this one. We had a project that was a partnership with the Psych Science Accelerator. And I think it was, 2017 or 2018, right when the Psych Science Accelerator was like a little optimistic baby. And John, this back when John was director, John Gray was director of CREP, got together with the director of PSA and decided that there was going to be a collaboration. And so we picked a study in the traditional way, and then we brought it to the PSA board at the time, and they agreed, okay, we'll do this. We'll have our network collect data on this. And this is my favorite study in the world to talk about because it does, I do say the word squirrel many times every time I'm talking about it. So if you have dogs there in the background, I learned this through one of my students, you may want to put them in another room because apparently I drive everybody's dogs crazy when I talk about the study. It is an experimental philosophy paper, the Turi, Buckwalter, and Blow. And the original paper had participants read 3 different vignettes, and they had to make some sort of decision about what the protagonists knew or believed. So in the vignette we were replicating, there is a researcher named Daryl, and he is looking for squirrels in a park, so in a national park. And his job is to look for squirrels and document, did he see a squirrel or not? So there are 3 different conditions. And in one of the conditions, he said he saw a squirrel, and he actually did see a squirrel, and it couldn't have been anything else because there are only squirrels in this park. I don't know. It's the weirdest park ever. This isn't the actual vignette. This is my elaboration on it. So in the second condition, he saw a squirrel. It could have been a prairie dog because there are also prairie dogs in the park, but Daryl doesn't know that there could be prairie dogs in the park. So he says it's a squirrel, but it actually is a squirrel. And in the third condition, he says it's a squirrel and it's actually a prairie dog. And so, the participant is asked, did Daryl know or just believe that he saw a squirrel? And in that first case, where it couldn't have been anything else, a lot of people say no. In the third case, where he said he saw or he said he knew, they say he knew he saw a squirrel. In the third case, where he said he saw a squirrel, but it was actually a prairie dog, they say, no, he just believed. But in the second case, it's kind of interesting because it's like, well, people, even though it could have been a prairie dog, he didn't know that. People tend to say like he knew. It's called a Gettier case. And this is, again, I won't get too far into this, but people tend to say that he knew and didn't just believe. So that was what we were trying to replicate. And one of the interesting things and I think this is important for a couple of different reasons. One of the reasons I think it's important to talk about this study is because this is the reason why we probably won't do another registered replication report, at least anytime soon, because we did a registered replication report with this study, which is something CREP hadn't done before. Mark was here, like kind of holding my hand through this whole thing. So I'm sorry if I've like brought up a painful past for you, Mark. The study that we had was pretty easy. There were a few different conditions. There was some decision making. There were some, there's some different pieces of psychology that are pretty interesting. And the analysis was like a chi-square, which was great. And then we submitted it to Advances in Methods and Practices in Psychological Science. We ended up with a much more complicated design, a very complicated design, 3 different vignettes, but like a mixed method or a mixed ANOVA type analysis. Each person was only exposed to 1 vignette at 1 level. So it was like there were 9 possible conditions, but they'd only have 3 of them. The analysis was a multi-level model at the pooled level. At the site level, it would have been a mixed ANOVA. And so we didn't require our CREP participants to do like a results and analysis component to that. We just gave them, completion marks after they uploaded their raw data, which they didn't really even, like they would get from us because most of the data collection was centralized. We did allow people to collect data on their own. And a few sites did use a Qualtrics version of this study, but most sites far and away use a centralized SOCI survey. And so we, set up their surveys for them and we set up the randomization for them and we collected the data and like they would send a link to participants, but that's about it. So it wasn't it was a really good, I think, experience for us as admin, but I don't know as far as CREP experiences go, how great it was for some of the students. I think other students, it was a really good fit for because they were advanced and they could handle some of this stuff. Certainly one of my students at the time is the first author on it. So that's Braden Hall. He was a master's student here and then now he's at Carbondale. So that's a place. Yes. Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. Yes. And so that I think was really great for him, but it kind of took something that was a little picked for how easy it was and then made not easy. And it wasn't the research question that made us choose this study. It was the actual, the ease of it. So, and the reason I mention this is because this gave us one of the best extension hypotheses that that I think we have seen in terms of like its implementation that is now in the process of being published, I believe. So Mike Andrachik was the executive reviewer on this. They did this project at their school with his student, Caitlin Larkin, who was also the CREP assistant for this project. And so she was really involved in it. And they ended up adding an expertise vignette to this. So they wanted to vary like how much the person was perceived to be an expert. It's theory based. It was very cool. They collected a bunch of data. They have, I'll put this in the chat so you all can see this. And so, okay. And then I think you can see the expert vignettes that they added. And then, yes, and they're working on getting this published in like I think maybe even an experimental philosophy journal. And that's the ultimate goal really, is like, can we take this? And I think if we can do this with like the most complicated project that we have, there's probably hope for other folks as well. Now, Caitlin, I mean, was really dedicated, was a CREP assistant. I went to email Caitlin to jump in on the, to see if she was available for the CREP alum thing. And I pulled up a Yale email address for her. So I think she's probably going to grad school there. And that could be a different Caitlin Larkin, but I don't think it is. So I think it might be a nice sort of model to follow, what they ended up doing. And at some point I hope to debrief with them just to see like, what was your experience like, yada, yada. Now, most of our projects won't end up, most of our extension hypotheses won't end up like this, but I do think that they are very nice for students to have and to present. My experience has been, and if your experience hasn't been this way, I'd love to hear it. But when I have students present like at our school, we call it Student Scholar Day, where students present their work. If they present just a replication, they seem to get a lot of like, well, what's special about your research? And it's really funny. One of the years they did this, my group did just a straight up replication presentation. We did this, we replicated this, here's the replication crisis, blah, blah, blah. And then they were next to like a chemistry poster that was also like straight up a replication study. They just used different words. And my students got pelted with questions about like, well, why is it important to do the same science over again? But the chemistry student was like, it could have been biology. It wasn't asked any questions. And so it was really interesting. I think for the presentation's sake, folks seem to accept it a little bit more when there is some kind of extension on it. Like, well, in what way did you make this yours? And what did you add to this? How is this your project? I'm not agreeing with that, but that's at least the experience that they have had. So I wanted to show you some more examples of extension hypotheses and then open it up for conversation. This is one that we have already looked at. And this is the one from Tufts. I like to use this as an example because, oh gosh, and I think Dana actually sent me the link to this at some point because I was trying to find the auxiliary hypothesis. They call them auxiliary hypotheses. I have found this in the past, and I have given this to my students as examples of like, this is the type of rationale I'm looking for. These are the types of extensions I'm looking for. I usually explain to them, if anybody can find this faster than me, please go ahead and do it. Okay, used. Nope, that's not going to be it. Okay. I'm going to go back up here. That was their study. Okay, this was their analyses, and I don't think that is what we want. But there's one page, we have seen this, yes? And you have seen all of the examples. I'm trying to think, okay, here we go. Here are the different groups pre-registrations. So maybe this will take us to the right place. Yes, okay. So I just didn't scroll down long enough. They have the materials of what they needed to add, and then their specific hypothesis. With like often a very brief rationale. So we hypothesize that participants who say no to English being their first language will perform with higher accuracy on the standard problem, which is, I think that this is probably a hypothesis we could spend some time unpacking. And they ask participants, is English your first language, yes or no, or decline to answer. And so you can kind of go through these and take a look at, I think this is sort of what I would expect for like a 200 level group of students who don't have a lot of sort of theory. There, you can look at some of the other groups. Let me put this link in here as well. Oh, somebody found it for me. Is this the one where it's all on one page? Yes. Yes, okay. So I think this is helpful to, I guess I should probably bookmark this at some point. I just always waste half an hour finding it. Some of them have like kind of a better rationale than others. And one of the things that we did in my class one semester was we looked at these and we kind of rank ordered them based on, how based in theory they are, or how kind of high quality they are. And it was interesting. The types of things that they rated as more high quality weren't exactly the things that I rated as more high quality. So it gave us a chance to kind of talk about, like, they thought anything that had a citation was automatically like better, or things that were about more like abstract concepts were better. Whereas I was like, well, no, things that just have a very like more straightforward. I preferred things that had a very clear like conceptual definition, but also like connected really well to the operational definition. So I think the way that they did this was just very nice. And they have 20 different examples. And so I think, let's use those. And once I think a student has seen an example or two of what we kind of expect of them, they're like a lot better at being able to produce that themselves. So, and again, this is for a large 200 level class of students. So I think, that's been really helpful. And I can work on finding some more examples of extension hypotheses. I mean, if you kind of click around on the CREP, the different forks of the different projects, you'll find some that have extension hypotheses. So go to the CREP main page and go to the studies. And if you are interested in, like, let's say you are doing the Troy et al. You would go to the Troy et al. Page and then go to the list of forks to see, what projects have been completed. It says there are 50 forks, but you won't see all of them because a lot of them are still private. Here's one at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Ooh, I've never heard of that university before. No, that's definitely Amanda's. And so here we can see that they are conducting a direct replication plus extension. You can usually pick that up pretty quickly on their description. So we will also include extension hypotheses concerning other factors related to cognitive reappraisal and depression symptoms. And then you can see, what they have added. So here are their videos, here's their procedure, here's their data is down here through GitHub. They probably talk about their extension hypothesis in their wiki. So you can see the 4 different groups. And then there was one class that did an extension together. And here's Ellen's for the Sparkman and Walton. This looks great, Ellen. Thank you so much. This is really helpful. And yeah, this is organized really nicely. And yeah, and some of them are quite a bit longer and some of them are less long. You know, one kind of problem that I think is important to mention, and I'll stop sharing for a second, and I think we've touched on this already, and I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on this, is, you know, you're always weighing this, how long do I want the survey to be, against how many extension hypotheses do I include? And I think, you know, every problem has a solution, even if it's not, I mean, within replication work that we're doing in our classes. It may not be a great solution, but, you know, it'll get a passing grade. So I did almost say B's get degrees, and I just feel like I shouldn't perpetuate that, but it is one of those situations. So what I tend to do, and I really don't mean to like make it sound like my solutions are the best solutions by any means, but usually like I will have everybody propose their own extension hypotheses and pitch them. And then we'll talk through like which ones may be the best and kind of vote on them. And then run through like, okay, we have this one that everybody voted very highly, but if we do this one, we can't do these other 4 because this one takes participants a long time. This is like a 30 question inventory, and we want to keep our study under a certain amount of time. So, and so we'll talk through that as a class of like, well, what do we have to give up? Like, what do we have to keep? And then if there's one student who's just deeply committed to their extension hypothesis, like that's fine, but then you have to collect 100 participants yourself. Or, you know, or find, you know, money to put it on Prolific or something like that to collect. So just keep that in mind, that like this, I think what a lot of these classes did, I think in Heather's case, this is true. And Ellen, you can remind me how your class did it, where all of these different groups collected the same original replication studies, but then they put their extension hypothesis on like their link and sent that link out to people. So it wasn't like every single participant for every single group had every single extension hypothesis. It was, yeah, Ellen, can you share how you did that, how you organized that?
Mine didn't have lengthy scales. They were questions about, do you have friends or family members that are vegetarian? They were all into vegetarian adjacent. And would you consider where you grew up rural or urban? So there were just a few questions. So everybody got those questions after the main ones. But I can see if you had a theoretical foundation for your extension hypothesis that you might be using a scale, that would be more questions.
Totally. And I think that was the case with some of, and that may happen in your class, but also like, I wouldn't want to promise everybody that they could do an extension hypothesis. Because some of these just like one person, I remember once one person proposed like, well, does their knowledge of, oh yes, I'm sorry, this was the Troy et al, I believe, because a lot of the participants were psychology students. So they wanted to look at like, does your knowledge of psychology end up influencing like how you do this because you know about, you know, these types of questions, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, that sounds interesting, but like, how do you assess psychological knowledge? And they're like, well, with the tests, because that's what they know. And I'm like, well, so in order to have like good like content validity, you know, like, do you want to like just ask about, and there was no way of like narrowing down like like a more objective measure of their knowledge without, and it really was interesting conversations, but without adding like an extra 40 minutes on to their participants' time. So that can get kind of messy, and it reroutes us back a lot to this conversation about like you know, one of the ways we can do harm in our research is by using our participants' time for things that like don't necessarily matter that much. We really have to weigh like, what are we getting out of this against, and if the primary thing is that we're getting out of it is like pedagogy, like pedagogical, like they're adding this extension variable for learning purposes, then maybe we kind of need to limit how much of our participants' time we use, which is uncomfortable, but nobody's rioted. So yes, your IRB insists to award 0.5 SONA credit. It needs to take, so we do it like 0 to 30 minutes is 0.5. So if your study is like 12 minutes, it counts as 0.5. 12 counts the same as 30. I don't know. That's the best way. Okay, so let me stop rambling and sort of kick it back to discussion. So what questions do you have about extension hypotheses? What ideas do you have? Let's brainstorm.
I was gonna say, well, one of the times when I've done this that I thought I had the most success at eliciting extension hypotheses, at least in my experience, was they read a few articles that were all kind of like loosely related, and so some of the students were able to kind of identify maybe interesting connections between the two and thinking about how they might go together. Yeah, and I thought I did that by accident. But it wouldn't have to be by accident, and so I think that's one possible route. Another is like, it depends a little bit on the study and the participant population you have, but I could imagine like if you have access to a range of ages, for example, you could have them also read an article about like that maybe summarizes a variety of differences along age, and then they could maybe have them think through how that might apply to the target study. You could pick out other variables that might work for that besides age, but that's what I've kind of found useful is putting the tools in their hands and then letting them see having them work through how those tools might be connected.
Also corrected though, sometimes. Yeah, it's a fair word to use.
Bill, you had your hand up and then you put your hand down.
I did. Yeah, I got fatigued holding it up the whole time. So thanks for talking to us about this. Jared was really helpful the other day, kind of with our one-on-one, just asking all my random questions. So the idea is to preserve the integrity of the replication, not screw with kind of the core features of it. But beyond that, just because all of you have seen so many things and reviewed a ton of things, is it usually the case that they mostly tack on questions at the end, or they do something where they get a different subject population and look at some moderating factor, or look at some alternative explanation? Like, what's kind of the modal thing that people do? Is it that they add questions onto the end, or I don't know. I'm just curious what the average CREP user kind of does.
The modal thing that I see as a reviewer of these things is they add questions onto the end. That's pretty common, and look at it as a moderator, for example. And depending on the study design, they might like add an alternative DV. But it would be totally feasible to add another condition. I just think that for a lot of people, getting the extra participants is actually of an alternative condition is challenging, and so that's not as done. But if you have easier access to more participants, and then I think that's feasible. I also think though that students are not typically thinking in that frame of mind of adding a condition, but it's totally possible. I mean, we'd be down for it.
Like randomly assign them to two different stimuli. One is the original one. Like that wouldn't violate the kind of mesh thing.
Right. So as long as you can pick out the original comparison, and that still has the same integrity, then it's fine. So one example, we haven't finished analyzing this, because I'm slow, but one of the ones we did recently is it's like this fake news study, and they basically find that if you give people true and false headlines, and you give them to them multiple times, they're more like they believe them more when they've received them more times. And we actually, and because well, Bill knows this because we're at the same place, but our subject pool is gigantic. And so, you can add on a lot actually and still be kind of okay. But we added on 2 conditions. One that's supposed to like maximize their kind of like goal to be consistent with their partisan identification. So remind them like, hey, you're a Republican or you're a Democrat. Don't you feel good about that? And then another condition, obviously we're phrasing it differently than this, just to be clear. But and then in another condition, we really like prompt them and try to get them to be accurate. And we're going to see if these kind of ramp up or ramp down this initial kind of repetition effect. But those are all just new conditions. So we started off with like the original conditions of the study and then added on these 2 additional versions of it.
That's also an interesting case too. That's the Pennycook et al. Study, because the stimuli that come with them are photographs and news stories that are relevant to the 2016 election. And so there was a lot of discussion when we first adopted the study of like, are we going to update those stimuli? We communicated back and forth quite a bit with Gordon Pennycook on like what his thoughts were on that. And we decided to stick with the original stimuli, but then I think even on the wiki for this main study, we recommend like you add another condition where you have updated stimuli, like if you want, but you will have to double your participants because we want an N of X for like an N of X. We want an N of this amount, just for the main study, but then you can add whatever you want, like that's totally fine. And I think that's what Caitlin did. And I should have mentioned this. I'm sorry. When she added these conditions for the accelerated CREP study, she added more participants for that as well. So she hit her target N for our main study and also whatever she needed for the new vignettes as well to compare those. And we've had, one of the first studies that worked really well for this was the Elliott et al., the Red Rankin Romance study. And one of the first examples of an extension hypothesis, was what John did in his group, where he had participants, in this study, there's a photo of this is what the original paper says, a moderately attractive young Latino man is surrounded by either red or gray. And he had participants look up like, what are some other backgrounds he had his students look up, what are some other backgrounds that might elicit like different responses and how might they influence? And so like one group had like a yellow background for this. And that was all like based in theory. And they like read these papers about how fish behave or something like that. I may be messing that up. This is not a crystal clear recollection, but that's the original N in that study was only 37. So it was pretty easy to like add. So there were 2 conditions for that. So you cut that in half and then add this third condition. But that study was all like in person too, because you had to like show the participants the photo while you weren't looking at it, so it didn't influence you. Yeah, it's a good question. Are other folks thinking about adding extension hypotheses to what they're doing or sort of doing it differently? Okay, can we hear some thoughts on what folks are planning on doing and how they might implement this? Shelby, you wanna tell us what you're thinking?
Sure. Yeah. No, I don't have, I was literally like, these are so helpful because I'm always like jotting down my notes and like editing my like in progress syllabus while we're going. I'm definitely thinking of kind of having them pitch these sort of after, doing a bit of lit review, but I'm still definitely working on what I'm thinking. But I do I do definitely want, if I could make it work for all of the groups to have an extension hypothesis, they would have something unique to present and things like that. One thing I was kind of thinking, again, I thought of this in the last 5 minutes, so disclaimer. But after my one-on-one, we were talking about like giving them, whether to give them a choice over the project we'd be replicating or just kind of pick something, because we've heard from people who kind of did both. And, after the one-on-one, I was kind of advised to like, give them a choice. I do like that idea. It wouldn't be a ton of options since it does very much have to be an experimental project. And I probably need to clear like with our IRB, like which ones might be the most feasible, which I'm working on now. But so their first assignment would kind of be that like, okay, which project do you think we should do? But also kind of like justify it. Like, why are you thinking that? And I thought it could be kind of fun to start them on that train so they can see a little bit of how these progress over time. If they pitch like how, like right now, like knowing nothing, what would you add, just to see then like what are some ideas we had and how can we actually, so that I'm not getting that feedback to them like once they've proposed their final kind of extension hypotheses and we're a month or two into the semester and it's a little more intense, so that we can maybe kind of model this a little bit more. But I'm very early in thinking about this.
Yeah, I think that works. And we had this discussion too of like, that was one of those places where I learned, okay, students should come to the pitch with their stimuli or if not complete, but close to complete, because yeah, it's great to say that a student's knowledge of psychology will influence this variable, but how are you measuring that? And part of the pitch has to be, how long is this going to take? Like, how many resources will this use? Which was definitely a mistake that I made.
Yeah, I feel like that's like it's really abstract for them until there are some examples. And maybe I'll just make some examples of like things that I think would be really hard to do and walk through why those would be really hard for us to do, so they can kind of practice critiquing those ideas and saying, okay, why would this be difficult? Because I think that at least I've experienced this before. I haven't done CREP in class, but with the experimental psych projects, right, where it's like just thinking about all of this really cool stuff that you could do, and it's like, okay, how do we bring this back down to earth of like what we can actually achieve?
Oh, totally. And I think that this is actually where it was nice that the knowledge of psychology came up as a construct, because that was a really good example of like, could that influence? Absolutely. But it led to this it was a really heated discussion too, because there were some folks who were like, well, we could measure their knowledge, like their psychology GPA. And it was like, but my GPA is low because I partied for my first couple of years. And like, just conversations about like what test scores really mean and and they were into that where they weren't necessarily into other things. And so that was a great, like, if I can give you one with a bow, like just like an extension hypothesis, like knowledge in a content area, which would apply to any of our studies. So knowledge of abnormal psychology or knowledge of cognitive psychology. Is something that you're like, here's an example of an extension hypothesis that would be really messy. Or like stress hormones. It's another good one. It's like, who is buying the Q-tips? Who has the microscope? That's the extent of my knowledge on how you measure hormones. So I know there are Q-tips and microscopes at some point. Are there any other, folks don't really have questions or, oh God, really? My knowledge is, what do they use now?
It's called passive drool, which is disgusting name for just letting you spit in a tube. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes my cat takes a really deep nap and there's passive drool as well. But I was
Data
gonna,
collection opportunity.
yeah, I just missed opportunities, so many. I was gonna say, just from the on the review side of things for extension hypotheses, one thing that can make that go a little bit smoother is just including a short blurb about like what the extension hypothesis is. Sometimes like I as in my role as an executive reviewer, I actually don't tend to really care if people are really clear about this on their OSF pages, but I notice that the reviewers in general are. And you know, if just like, hey, we're going to include the big five for exploratory purposes, they don't find that. They're like, well, tell us more. And I think even just a sentence or two is enough. This does not need to be a full lit review or anything even approximating that. But I think that will help the review process go more clearly. The other bit that will help the review process go more smoothly is to just be really, really explicit that the original replication study is still kind of has its integrity. So that might mean we're including these additional measures for exploratory purposes. They come after the completion of the original study, and just be really clear about that. Or if you're going to add conditions, it's like we have the two original conditions and we're adding a third one. And then also when you go to talk about what analyses you'll do, just be clear, like the replication analyses are focused on the original conditions or the original measures, but then for exploratory purposes or fun or profit or whatever, you're looking at these other ones. But just being really explicit about that is useful. And it's it's one of these things where it's not that anybody really distrusts anybody as they're going through this process, but it's something that we want to make sure is in there so that we know and know for sure that everybody's on the same page.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'm trying to look up the language of what we say about this in the step-by-step guide, because I think that the wording is sort of clear. I'll find that at some point and send it along to you all too. The other thing I think that might be helpful to know is that, and some of you know this already, is that a lot of the original authors, when they're communicating with us, will suggest extension hypotheses. And the nice thing about that is, they've kept up with this literature. Like they know what's going on in this area, and so a lot of them have like good ideas, or they and they'll send those along to us, and they'll say, and we'll ask them if we can post that along with the rest of the materials, like if we can post our conversation we had, and get them to give us the most precise wording as possible for our students. Like, keep in mind that this is being communicated to students who are not familiar with the field, and they do a really good job with this, I think. And so some of them will say, well, political party might moderate this relationship, or this might not really be we're writing up the Going Green to Be Seen replication right now, and what Riskavicius said was to the green products aren't maybe really trendy anymore, so they're not necessarily like a way for people to signal that they have high status, because people have these green, they're not connected to like any sort of status, at least with in possibly the United States. And so but then also they'll suggest these additional things, right? And so what happens is a lot of student teams will end up latching onto those and saying like, yeah, that does sound interesting. Let's write up the rationale for that, and let's use that as an extension hypothesis. And then if enough people collect data on that extension hypothesis, we'll sort of like collapse them in the main. So in the Griskavicius, like, we did have a lot of people look at political party, and some of them used it on like a 7-point scale, and some of them did like categorical, but we tried to like kind of collapse them and look at that as a moderator. And so we were able to point to like specific groups that had done it this way, and have that for our exploratory analysis in that paper, and reach out to those teams to see like, are you interested, in being part of the publication, which we do anyway, but it's like they may feel more like ownership over it, knowing that they did like this extension hypothesis that's then being discussed in the main paper. Okay, I want to put something in the chat, and then maybe what we can do is take our break. Here is the schedule from the first couple weeks. We don't have today's on here yet, but slide 6 has this set of wish list items. I'm going to close out my comment to myself on slide 6. And in fact, it looks like it is getting kind of full. So I'm going to add a second slide for people to add additional wish list items too. So if you're thinking about things based on the extension hypothesis discussion, the DEIA, like any of this stuff, you know, drop it in here, and this is what we're going to be working on organizing for the hackathon to get, you know, groups of people working on together. Are there any questions before we break? Did we just have a break? I don't know. Did I talk that whole time? Let's reconvene at like 1 o'clock. We should have student alums coming. If not, we can sort of reconvene and again talk about things that came up in individual meetings or how these specific implementations might work in your class. So yeah, okay. Actually, we're planning on having the Zoom meeting. So this past year we tried having Zoom meetings each week by project, and they didn't really go that well because we only really had one time for each project. And so I think what we're going to try to do instead is have them be sort of open, like whatever project you're working on, you can stop by at this time. And I would like for students to be able to stop by and talk to, you know, the student peer mentors, which I'll talk about just 1 second. But then also to have at least one, you know, instructor or like me, or we, I think, are close to getting a pedagogical consultant. Have somebody also there to talk to instructors as well, so you can kind of stop in and maybe have them at multiple times during the week, like office hours, but virtually. Okay, so the individual meetings during this upcoming week are being set. Now, 1 second, and I believe, so the individual meetings are just going to be continuations of discussions of how to implement these in your particular classes, or just how you can use CREP or its tools, or even contribute to them or get involved. I mean, they can be kind of open, but I think because we're going to start meeting 6 with this tools you're developing, it makes the most sense for us to talk, or your syllabi, your course materials, whatever it is. I think it makes the most sense to talk about questions you still have or ideas you have for implementing these. You know, I know a couple of the individual meetings that I had, probably not the most shocking thing on earth, got like a little bit off track from time to time, and we ended up talking about some other like useful things. And so if there's something that's really that you have a lot of questions about, you know, I think that's probably fine to like go in one specific direction. Yeah, okay, so questions about that? So let me
Zoom link, and then we get put in breakout rooms.
Breakout rooms. Yep, I think that seemed to work okay. If you come in and there are a couple people already meeting, then, you know, just hang out. We're not talking about anything top secret.
Entertain yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay. Okay, so we have Anna with us. So let me introduce you to Anna. Oh, and then I'm going to pass it, Jared. I'm going to pass it off to Jared so Jared can host. I just wanted to, can I spend a minute talking about the peer mentors really quick? Jared? Okay. This is something we're new. In the past, we've had CREP assistants. where like students will be assigned to do administrative tasks by project. And we've always kind of struggled with like how to work with folks, because some folks are just really on the ball, and I don't mean for that to sound like others aren't, but some folks have a lot of free time, are like more advanced students, and have probably like different things that make this so. But some students answer their emails more, you know, don't have jobs, blah blah blah. And it's always been tricky to kind of supervise them, at least from my perspective, because I don't necessarily have all of the time to like dedicate to doing that. So we're with this grant, we transitioned to more of a peer mentor that has a more clear like set of responsibilities. We have a lot of the stuff that the CREP assistants helped with were like tracking submissions and like tracking details about the submissions, but now we have like new infrastructure that is helping us keep track of that. So we have ways of submitting reviews and requesting projects and all of that stuff that make that a little bit less necessary. So the peer mentors are going to be more like whenever we need groups of students, like more advanced peers to do a lot of different roles. So they'll have different hats. We have 6 of them this upcoming year. One of them is at Twin Cities. 2 of them are from Avila, I believe. I think it's 2. It might be 3. It was really easy for me to talk people into applying them because like they're right here, and I'm like, yeah, you should apply for this. And they will do things like follow up with teams to make sure they're making progress. We're also bringing our peer mentors to NCUR to, you know, present their work, hopefully, but also to see like what a big conference is like. Yeah, and they'll be there to act as, they'll attend these meetings. They're being supervised by the CREP employee, Holly. And so they'll attend these Zoom meetings that are like open office hours for the students. They'll help us with study selection and all of that stuff. So that being said, Anna is one of our peer mentors for this upcoming year. Yay. She's not tired of me yet. Anna is a junior?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. And so it is also in my lab and just took me for stats methods, and we've worked together in the food pantry too, which is nice. And so the purpose of asking her to come, I also asked another student come who hopefully will be here after a while, but is to talk about their experiences using CREP. So yes, that is the end of me talking. Anna, are you okay with this being recorded?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna go on mute, and yeah.
Am I talking about CREP now?
So I can introduce you a little bit.
Okay.
Hi, Anna. Thanks for coming. I know there should be more people here, so I think what I want to do is just kind of make this an informal Q&A. Sorry, one sec. Just to like take some burden off of you, where you don't have to like just be talking to us this entire time. So I think we could use this time to also talk about the individual meetings that we have that we had in the past in a group setting, and to get Anna's perspective and hopefully other people's perspective as well, if they can show up. You know, a lot of the questions were like, how do I implement this in a class size of X? Or what do I do if I get, you know, hung up at IRB, or I get hung up in CREP review? You know, what should I do with the students? So it's kind of nice to have a student perspective. So Anna, if you just want to quickly introduce yourself and maybe talk a little bit about your involvement with CREP, that'd be great.
Okay, so I'm Anna. I'm a junior at Avila studying psychology, and I was part of 2 different CREP experiments, one in our stats and methods class and then one in our research lab. And so it was really interesting to see how both of them were working at the same time and being part of both.
Hey, thank you. And I think, again, in the interest of time, if people maybe just want to, you know, use that same introduction as before and just put it back into chat so that Anna knows who she is talking to here. While you're doing that, if anybody has a question, you could also put that in chat or just raise your hand. I will start and have Anna actually just answer one of the questions that I think came up the most in the individual meetings, which is, when you were doing the CREP review, how did you do it? Did you do it as a class? Did you do it in small groups? Was it individually? What kind of experiences have you had?
So for the most part, it would be we would start in class and then see how far everybody would go, and then branch off and do it on our own after class. And then with Dr. Waggy's class, usually we would have a day to like review it and make sure everybody did it correctly.
Mhm.
And if not, then we went over and made sure people were still on the same page.
Okay. So in the class, was that class wide?
Yeah.
Dana, you're not talking to us, are you? Okay, sorry. And how big were the classes that was implemented in?
I think there were like a little less than 30 of us in the
Okay.
class.
Okay, perfect. So that should all give you some idea of Anna's experience. And I will let these intros trickle in and you can read those. So take just a moment to do that.
And a quick question for clarification. So you're a peer mentor at your college for students who are doing CREP projects at your college, or are you a CREP peer mentor that we can refer our students to if they have questions?
Yeah, do you know the answer to that, Anna? I know it's a new position for you.
No, I don't.
Okay. Jordan, can I turn that over to you? Thanks.
Sure, it is CREP for CREP in general. So not just at the institution.
Okay.
But yeah.
These are new grant funded positions. Got to get that grant money.
Oh, this is awesome. Thank you. Be great for students, even just for help setting up the page or finding how do I register my projects or how do I add contributors or, questions like that. Sometimes they get stuck on it. How do I give more privileges to, the contributors or things like that? That would be great.
Yeah, that's kind of the hope, because students seem to be a little bit less intimidated or hesitant to ask, other students for questions. There's, I think for a lot of mine, there's this assumption that they feel like they should already know how to do everything, and they don't, want to look like they don't. And so that's, part of the goal.
And again, as these intros are filtering in, if you want to post any questions in chat or raise your hand or send those to me in a private message, I can ask those of Anna. Jordan, who else do we have potentially joining us today?
So the other person was going to be Jasmine.
Okay.
And, it's a possibility that something came up. What's the schedule? Oh, sorry. Okay. All right. I thought you were trying to send me a message. Yeah, and I reached out for a whole bunch. I've really underestimated how difficult it would be to get folks here over the summer. So Anna, I have some kind of I have a spare medal or sticker or something, or ribbon for you in my office. You can wear it around your neck on the first day of school.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, and one of the concerns that I have is trying to get a sense of how much students know and don't know going into it. So can you talk a little bit about maybe the problems that you feel like you encountered trying to get, a CREP project going?
I would say it was a bit of an issue when we had several, because when we were choosing our experiment to replicate, because kids, like myself included, find it a little difficult to read really professional or more professional research papers. And so thankfully Dr. Waggy helps us read those and takes it one bit at a time to make sure we understand what's actually happening, because without that it would have been really confusing. And so that was a bit difficult. And then learning about OSF was a little difficult, but that I got the hang of, and so it was fairly easy once you understand what you're doing.
And did Jordan provide help there with like how to
Yeah.
navigate an OSF page? Okay. One of the concerns too that came up in some of the individual meetings that we had last week was getting all of the students on board. You know, like sometimes I think if I just assign a project, you know, maybe half of the students aren't interested in that project and then they don't have any motivation to do anything. So was there anything that you felt like helped with that where, you know, you guys were invested in the project?
So we voted for our project, and so the one that got the most votes was the one that we chose. And so I assume by doing that method that everybody was like, okay, everybody else wants to do it instead of it just being assigned. And so they felt a little more motivated. But
Did you do extension hypotheses as well?
yes,
Did
there
that,
was,
were you able to do, you know, more personalized extension hypotheses?
there were 2 extension hypotheses, I believe, for our class one. One of them was to include sound, and then the other one was a different method.
We have a question here in chat to me. Curious what Anna perceives as the most helpful thing that their faculty advisor, Jordan, did to help navigate the process, trying to figure out what, quote, essentials I should include in the CREP journey.
So she really helped us understand it. And so it was really going super slow at the beginning and then progressively getting faster instead of just bombarding us with everything at the beginning. And so it took us a few days to like fully read through the research paper. And then it took us a few days to get started. And so it took several class periods instead of just one class period doing this and then the next class period doing something else.
Okay. Yeah, that's one of the things too that people were concerned about before. And I'm curious what a student perspective is on this, if you've had one where, you know, you might get hung up in CREP review or IRB review, and then there's now downtime where, you know, it was allotted that you'd be doing this project during this time, and now you're not. Did you experience that?
A little bit. I think there was a brief moment during us waiting for our IRB approval, but it wasn't super long, and then we were still able to continue fairly quickly.
Okay, and what did you do during that downtime?
I don't remember,
Okay.
to be honest.
Jordan doesn't either, okay.
It was like these, you know, these class days were like interspersed between like content type days. Like we don't have a separate lab. So it's like they're also doing statistical analyses in general and like how to write a paper and doing content areas. So it was like we were doing something, probably, maybe.
What was your perception of that? Was there a, you know, did it feel like it was slapdash and haphazard, or did it feel like, you know, everything was going accordingly? I feel like that's a concern where we try to implement these things and you're going to run into problems. And did it feel like that was happening, or did it feel like things were planned out well?
A mixture of both. For the most part, it felt like things were planned out. And then when it came to like actually doing the study and waiting for our approval, it was like we had to wait and do other stuff. But for the most part, it felt like it was going according to time.
Yeah. How did other students respond to that? I know sometimes students don't like it when things don't work out well in the classroom. You try something new, it doesn't work out, and then they kind of resent that at times.
From what I could tell, no one really like, it didn't bother anyone as much because we just continued class and did normal things. And so I didn't see anyone think it was bad.
Yeah. I'm going to read another question for you here. Sorry to pepper you with so many questions. Is there any advice or things you think students should know before they get started on a CREP project, or anything you wish you knew before you started?
I would say that everybody, or at least a lot of people, are on the same boat as you, and so they don't understand everything immediately like you probably won't. And so it's okay to like ask questions and make sure you fully understand before moving on, instead of just being like, oh, okay, I get it, and then being confused later on.
Yeah. And I'm guessing that's something that Jordan does in class, right? Where you can have maybe groups or class discussions where you can all realize you're not on the same page.
Yeah.
Also took a while to get moving.
Yeah, this is just something to keep in mind that I always forget to warn people about, but we did a lot of stuff in class. Like we added everybody to the OSF in class live. We signed up in class, and like one student was going to be the contact student who signed up to getting on board form. And I think she put like her Gmail or her Hotmail or something like that. And then she just didn't check that email again for a while, or it went to her spam or something like that. And so we thought we were waiting for a long time for our review, but it was really there. So you may want to put like the instructor's name as like the primary contact, because the reviewers don't always send it to like everybody on that contact list.
I think, and maybe just to turn the tables around a bit, are there questions that you have about CREP? Maybe to take some time off of you responding to my questions.
No, I don't have questions at the moment.
Okay. Well, I guess one thing that I'm concerned about with all of this is the learning outcomes that you got from this. What do you feel like doing CREP did for you? Did it improve your critical thinking? Did it do stuff like that?
I would say so, yeah. And it really improves my understanding of how these experiments work and how the whole process works. And so, because before people were just telling me things. And so for me to actually like do it myself made me realize like, oh, this is super cool. Or like, I don't like this part, but it's important. And so it was super cool to actually like do it hands-on compared to being told.
Yeah. Did it, what kind of results did you get? Did you replicate it successfully?
Yes, but our results were kind of iffy. There wasn't anything like significant about them.
Okay, so what did you take away from that experience? You tried to replicate it and you didn't?
Well, yeah. I would say the biggest thing is that we needed to include more people into our study. And so that's always a struggle when it comes to students recruiting people. And so it was just one of those things where it's like, oh, well, if we had more people, it could have been significant, but since we didn't, it wasn't.
That makes sense. Question here in the chat to me, did it increase your interest in research or doing research in the future?
Very much, because at the beginning, I was still on the mental health side of psychology, and now I'm on the research side. And so it very greatly improved my interest in research.
And I think you said this already. You plan on going to grad school?
Yes.
Okay. One thing that I have noticed is that if you read Branch and Dubow, I think 2020 and 2021, great publication, should check it out if you haven't already, but students were less likely at the end of the semester to endorse psychology as a science than they were at the beginning of the semester, except for the group that did an actual scientific project. And I'm curious, Anna, if you feel like doing that made you more likely to endorse psychology as a science, or maybe that didn't change your views at all?
I think it did a little bit, at least. I've always viewed psychology as a science, but not like a hard science. And so doing the research experiment was like, oh no, this is a normal science. It's just studying different areas.
Yeah. Jordan, do you have additional questions that you'd like to ask of Anna?
When I ask them, it feels like I'm interrogating her.
No,
So I'm like, what was your experience? Yeah, I think one of the things that I struggle with in that class is like having students make it their own versus having a lot of structure.
Mhm.
And because it's a 200 level class, I tend to err on the side of structure. Like I put together the surveys, I do the OSF, blah, blah, blah. So I'm just curious, and there's no right answer to this. Like consider me like hungry for constructive feedback. Like I love to hear ways I can improve my class and things could get better. And so you will not displease me by saying anything. Asterisks, like, right, there are some things that maybe, okay. Well, so do you perceive, like, how do you perceive that balance? Do you think that if I tried to have students kind of own it more and like put together those materials themselves more, like that it would be worth it in terms of like their ownership over the projects? Because it would be a lot more work for them. Or like, do you think that for like the level where everybody is, it sort of was an appropriate level of like support and like guidance, I guess?
I think for the most part, it was a good amount of support and guidance. For me, I would have liked a little more stuff that I could do hands-on, but that's just my opinion and how I do things. I'm sure other students were very grateful for what you did do, because that meant that we didn't have to do it and potentially mess it up. I know for making the survey, that was something I really wanted to do. But the OSF page, I was good with someone else taking care of it because I'm like, I don't know how that works. I'm good with someone doing that because I don't want to mess that up. But I feel like there's just there was a good balance, and I really liked it. But depending on the student, they might want more and they might want less, and so it's a hard balance to find.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I mean, I think I want to be able to reach like the really engaged students as well. And one of the things I'm thinking through is, well, I could have students fill out IRB applications or build the survey and turn them in. I don't have to use those, but I could have them do that.
Right.
And potentially what I could do is like have students like pick one. Like if you're interested in ethics, do the IRB. If you're interested in survey design, do the survey. If you're interested in, I don't know, I've reached the depths of my Wednesday cognitive resources. And I may brainstorm that with you a little bit in the future, just because I really, I mean, obviously, like your peer mentor, you're here, like you are one of the more deeply engaged students. Yeah, I thought about that too, about having it failing. I'm like, this is one of the things that we kind of lose with CREP. And students, I remember in my research methods class, we all had terrible hypotheses, except for like one student who designed like a scale on stereotyping, and he's a professor in Florida now and is like, whatever. We're friends on Facebook, and I remind him his project was so much better in research methods than mine. So, but they were all, I mean, it was all like, here are these variables. We gave our presentations at the end. Like, this is not how I would do this study again. No results were significant, blah, blah, blah. And like, it was a learning experience. And so, I don't know what we're missing. I don't know what we're losing by losing these terrible projects. All right, they're not all terrible. By losing these projects. Mine was terrible.
So we have a question here from Dana in the chat. I like to encourage students to fail and learn from failing. I do too. I know that students don't like that very much. Does the emphasis in CREP on gathering good data to be used to improve science create a mentality of having to succeed, or quote, do it right? Anna, do you have any thoughts on that?
I would say, yeah. So when we did gather our data and found that it wasn't significant, a lot of students were upset, I would feel like, but for the most part, it was like, well, here are ways we could do it better. And so like a lot of people had ideas on how to improve it. And so for us, failing that experiment was a good learning experience, because we were like, oh, okay, now we know how it works and how to do it better next time whenever we do an experiment again.
Yeah, do you have a sense of what some other student perceptions were of that failure to replicate?
I think a lot of students were like, we just didn't have enough people. That was our big thing. And so they were thinking of ways to recruit more people, because we did it through social media, and they were like, well, we could do it in person instead, and like find people on the street and do it instead. And so they were thinking of other ways to broaden our amount of people.
Well, if there aren't additional questions, we could let Anna go and we could discuss some of the individual meetings from last time. Does anybody have any final questions for Anna? Doing that thing where you silently count to 10 in your head, waiting for questions. How do you guys do that with your students and just stare at them? Yeah. All right, perfect. Anna, thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah. You were fun to have in class. You were in my COG psych.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good class.
It was a good class. Yeah.
Not to like toot my own horn, but it was fun. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Anna. See you.
Bye.
Okay, so I need to leave at around 1:50, and I need to chug water before I do leave. I have a doctor's appointment where I have to get 32 ounces of water in me before I go. So I'm going to keep drinking my water. But I'm curious if people want to use any time to discuss some of those individual meetings that they had. I know that people during those meetings expressed an interest to bring those to the group. And some of the questions were, I have 10, 50, 250 people in my classes. How do I implement it? What do I do with the downtime? Things like that. So if anybody does have those, we're happy to kind of discuss those as a group now.